basically looks at two things, like one is how are landscapes kind of understood, read, documented. That's one. Second is how are they kind of, like what, because drawing is a very powerful medium. So how do you kind of draw out and what are the implications of the way that a landscape is conceptualized or drawn onto the eventual manifestation of the landscape? And also the other way around, like there is an existing landscape and how do you kind of draw it out, or how have landscape architects in the past, when I say landscape architects, it could mean even architects who've done landscape works, the more famous ones, or the ones that have actually created a difference in the world, in the world of landscape architecture. So Swati Sheshadri would be doing the lecture today, and she's put together a very diverse palette of works from different times of this profession of landscape architecture. And over to you, Swati. So pay attention to the class. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and just be active and be alive. That's all. Yeah. Thanks, students. Yeah. Over to you, Swati.
Thanks, Anil. So hi everyone. Actually, the image that you see on the first page is also one of Burl Marx's drawings, and we will be visiting some of his works a little later. But I think it's captivating enough in the first go, and it kind of engages you completely. And I think that is the story of most of his drawings, and eventually the work that has been executed. So, to begin with, the first project that we're looking at it is actually Lunukanga Estate in Sri Lanka, and it's actually the ancestral home of Jeffrey Baba. Okay, I think there's a lag, so just be with me. Um, yeah, this is the ancestral home of Jeffrey Baba. So it's a very large estate which has been over time also been intervened by the architect himself, but it's largely kind of sitting within a green, uh, very lush greenscape, and you see the kind of buildings sitting within it. So as you kind of walk ahead, I think that's the water body side. Um, I am losing. Yeah. Okay. So as you walk ahead, you kind of also move towards the end, which is the water body side. Now, this is one of the sketches that somebody is probably put together after visiting the estate, and the idea was just putting this to at this point in the presentation to see how one is interpreting the landscape itself. And because there is so much of personality that even the trees and everything else in terms of objects within the landscape has, I think there is a lot of like intricate details that have been included within this sketch. And if you've ever visited a Bava project, you will realize that each object is kind of curated. Each frame is curated to help the visitor kind of experience the space very differently. And it's not only necessarily happening for the built part of the project, but it's also in the outside that happens. That there is a framed view even with the trees and all the landscape elements that he would have included. So again, you see that there are two sides of water bodies, and then this is this kind of a very lush estate which is sitting right in the middle. And within that, you will see there are sprinkles of many smaller uh, uh, built aspects in the project. And now we're coming to looking at some of the physical manifestations of the project. So initially you saw the drawings, and now you're kind of seeing the series of steps that lead you onto the entire project. There's a very long walk that you do before you enter the gate, the main gate of this project, and then there is a series of steps that takes you up, and then it kind of has uh, multiple buildings that you would visit. Some that you're not kind of allowed to visit, but some that you can spend time in. But that is largely it. Sandeep, if you would like to speak at any point, please do.
Sure, sure. Go ahead, Swati.
Um, this is another project by Baba, which is Kandalama. Again, I think the sensory experience of the project and just the whole access that is leading up to it. I think that has way too much intrigue, and then when the way the whole project sits within the landscape is absolutely captivating. Now, this is a hotel which is set within a landscape where there is a large lake beyond it. Now, this is essentially your built kind of mass within this green uh, scape. And what happens is when one is kind of taking that long road onto the to kind of visit this hotel. I think it's not, I mean, initially you don't even realize you're kind of leading up to a built space, because that's how well the project has now included the green and camouflaged itself completely. So very well, as much as you see in the drawing that it's kind of very hidden within the plan itself as well. I think it's true for when it happens when you see it in its actual form. Um, this is one of the sections, and the sections kind of still doesn't, I mean, beyond the building, the section does talk about the lush greenscape, and you see the textures of the wall and how the entire kind of topography is leading up to the building. But it necessarily doesn't capture how the green has then taken over the building itself, and how that the building has become a living mechanism in a sense. But that you kind of then see in the photograph. Unfortunately, this is a little pixelated. But essentially, what's happening with Kandlama is that it's sitting within this against this rock, this huge rock, and the rest of the building is kind of set against that. And there is a lovely kind of uh, formation of space that happens between the rock and the building itself, and that has been kind of carved together and worked with, and I think that is the most interesting space of the project. And so when you see this section, actually this is what the whole project is about also. And eventually, of course, the landscape has completely taken over, and you don't really see a built form anymore. It's kind of hidden within what the natural environment is. So this is one of the views that you would see from, if you were standing here at the building. That's what the building kind of looks like. And this is the interesting kind of section. As you go higher, you kind of get the space between the rock and the build form itself. There is this space where you can kind of dine and things like that. There's a bridge that connects you from the building towards this side, which is the rocky portion. And but that is the connection. So these are actually the foundations of the building, which are going down to the hard rock, and that is the kind of space that is being created. I think that enhances one's experience. But going back to you know how one represents that in a drawing versus how one experiences that in the physical space, I think uh, uh, there is some amount of give and take in that kind of visualization. I think all of it is not coming through here, which eventually you see.
Yeah.
Be- also because it's constantly evolving, so it's not possible to capture the whole thing immediately in the first go, but it will keep evolving and it will keep thriving. I think that's true for this project in particular.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that very quickly, if you look at Geoffrey Bawa's drawings, right, unlike any other architectural drawings which were made at that time, his drawings focused on the landscape quite a lot, right? I mean, like, look at this drawing in the plan, like you can hardly see the building. While many architects would argue during those eras, that the purpose of a drawing is to actually show the building, right? And the landscape is subsidiary to it. But then in Geoffrey Bawa's way of working is actually reflective in his drawing style as well, wherein the building kind of sits with the landscape, almost kind of sharing the same amount of importance between each. And also, if you look at this section, um, so in the section, like you'd find that the landscape is kind of stippled and drawn out with a lot of details. So what's interesting is that most of these drawings were not done by Geoffrey Bawa. Okay, Geoffrey had a colleague by the name of Laki Senanayake, who was an artist and a sculptor, and he was mostly responsible for most of the drawings which were produced in Geoffrey Bawa's office. But somehow the world knows it as his drawings. Unfortunately, this person, Laki Senanayake, passed away this year, like I think last month or something. If you're interested in reading more about him and his works, and so he also practiced architecture, you can actually Google him up and, kind of read about it. I'll just write his name there. Yeah, Swati, we can move on.
This is the Garden of Cosmic Speculation, which is by Charles Jenks. Again, I think this is one of his personal projects, and I think this was also interesting to kind of see how the quality of the drawing is put together, and you kind of see various spaces of different personalities coming together, and the way that the entire greenscape has been kind of drawn up, uh, along with the smaller kind of details that have been included here. Essentially, this project is more to do with uh, it has its influences from this whole interest he had in cosmic. Um, I'm losing some words. Sandeep, if you could help me here.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So this garden was an attempt. So Charles Jenks, I'm sure you guys would have heard of Charles Jenks somewhere. But if you haven't, it's a great idea to kind of look at it. Look at him, read up about him. He's also no more. Charles Jenks apparently had this. I mean, he's written a lot of books. Okay, I mean, not just with landscape, but also to do with architecture and space in general. So, I mean, he also practiced as a landscape architect, but his gardens were very different from the kind of gardens that used to happen around. And in the same manner, the way he used to draw or imagine or, actually sketch out sections was also a very different mode of, kind of doing this. So, in this particular plan, if you look at it, you can actually see a squiggly snake somewhere. You would be able to see, anthropomorphic forms which are kind of created using mounds. Uh, so his whole idea in this particular garden was to kind of create a garden which is almost like a metaphor of larger ideas onto a landscape. So in a way, this is a project which kind of transcends between landscape architecture and moves on to land art. Okay, LANDART. That's also another field of sculpting the land, both topographically and also, in terms of planting plants and, kind of using it as a canvas to kind of convey a certain meaning or a certain idea. Yes, Swati, over to you.
So taking that
I can
forward,
just
actually, see, yeah. Sorry,
hello.
Anju.
Yeah, Sandeep. So this is maybe not related to landscape, but since you guys are talking about Charles Jenks, just for students. So Charles Jenks actually wrote a very interesting book. It's called The Architecture of the Jumping Universe, and so what essentially he kind of the and that's also where a lot of these ideas came from, is that he says that the I mean, if you look at physics and you look at Newton and the Newtonian worldview, which is like, matter was finite, matter was defined, and matter was actually solid, whereas the Einsteinian worldview kind of said that matter and energy are interchangeable, and therefore everything that we see around us, which seems so solid and fixed, is actually not so. And so, based on kind of that kind of change of an understanding of what we see around us, he argues that, like, architecture has to change the way it sees things as fixed, as rigid, and and then he kind of goes about to kind of um, in a certain sense, justify various architectures that have happened, saying that these are the architectures of the new world, of a world where physics is not the Newtonian physics, and therefore he is interested in a lot of kind of physics theories, which is cosmology related to the cosmos, and some of those kind of ideas kind of take shape in this landscape. Yeah, so that's just a background.
Yeah, thanks, Jude, for that. Yeah. Yes, Vati, go ahead.
So like Jude and Sandeep actually spoke about it in detail. This is the manifestation of the project. Eventually, you see that as land art, and you kind of see that it's kind of molded and coming through from the earthscape itself. And you see a lot of the impressions that are happening on the floor, um, with the kind of ideas that Charles Jenks had. So some more images of the same thing. I mean, same idea, which is going forward. You also see how each of these are kind of in a sense carved to kind of create a certain kind of an experience and in a way of bringing people to kind of visit or root themselves in a certain way in the projects. I think those are those are ideas of how you can carve and kind of include people in a narrative in a sense also. um, the next architect artist we are going to see is Burl Marx. The first image that you saw was one of his drawings. These are some of the photographs of his projects, and I think the the visual kind of impact that Burl Marx's works have are very interesting, and he kind of plays with various forms, and once those are drawn out, I think they come into the physical manifestation almost directly as they were on paper. So most of his projects that you see, I think it's very easily identifiable. Even if you're seeing it for the first time, you know that this is a Burl Marx who's kind of put this together, and that is the personality of his work. Basically, there's a lot of like color, there's objects, there's shapes, um, and that's what these. I mean, these are three different projects. I think this is um, uh, the waterfront beachfront project, and then there is these are the other two. These are the same project, um, which are kind of 1 second. So yeah, this is another image of the roof garden. I think again it's a drawing which has then eventually been taken forward, but that's what the Burl Marx does, right? Like he's got like a lot of these forms and shapes that are coming together, and then each of them kind of signify a different aspect in the physical manifestation of it, and that's what you would see. So this kind of then becomes a space completely, and you can see that in the landform and the art that he puts together in ahead. So there's a lot of I mean many similar drawings that you would see, and probably some of y'all would also do study this work his work further and see the presentations, but you'll be able to come across some of these interesting works by him, and I think there is a whole book in the library also, where you would be able to kind of see the kind of drawings and sketches that he used to come up with before actually going into developing a whole project. This is another. This was interesting to put because it's almost a WD, working drawing that's coming through, but it's still kind of true to its form and the way that he's drawn it and kind of imagined it to be. So you can see that there are there is a hierarchy of a lot of these um, uh, what do you call strokes, and there is a hierarchy of spaces within a larger scape that is also created. It's also very easy to visualize one moving through it, so it's in a sense, in a plan, it's already a narrative. You can see that one can kind of walk through this entire space in a very in a form that the architect has designed it for. And I'm also only talking about it now from a visual perspective of how he's kind of given this personality, and how that kind of helps aid the whole experience of the space. um, yeah, and a lot of this also comes from an influence of natural forms. So this necessarily doesn't, it's not very crisp and hard edged, but it is extremely soft and inclusive of the natural kind of scape, and it plays with the natural forms a lot more. So it has this want to create more aspirational, happier kind of spaces with all the burst of color and the very fluid kind of forms that he has created.
Yeah, and Swati, if you can just go back one
Yeah.
slide. Yeah. So just to add to that, Roberto Burle Marx also believed that that there's this there's a philosophy called mimesis. Okay, which basically it's a Greek philosophy. I think it's either Aristotle or I don't know, Plato or somebody who kind of came up with it, wherein, in very simple terms, what it means is that, whatever happens in the daily lives, like in drama, in theater, in the lives of people, in the way that things are documented, they see that it's kind of mimicking the larger processes of nature. So that was like kind of the accepted theory. But then somewhere in the end of 19th century, Oscar Wilde, came up with a very, very influential writing, which kind of spoke about anti-mimesis, like, so the whole idea that art is not mimicking life, but rather life mimics art. So the whole idea was that, that through art, the artist could have an individual self-expression, which does not necessarily have to hold some sort of a relation to what is happening outside. And that has kind of inspired a lot of things, like Plato, um, the Cubist movement, the avant-garde movement, all of it kind of stems in some way from that sort of an approach, of kind of moving away from representing nature in its true form. Burle Marx was basically a big, believer in that philosophy. And what he also did was that, he kind of broke away. Like if you look at the drawings, you'll understand that, this is kind of timeless, right? I mean, like, how do you imagine landscape drawings to be made? Either they are highly sinusoidal or they are very orthogonal, in the sense that, the circle is perfect, the rectangle is perfect, like how it used to be in the Beaux-Arts days, right? Beaux-Arts is like, the kind of style that was prevalent, like let's say, in the end of the 19th century. So from there, if you actually look at the way that Roberto Burle Marx kind of took it up, in the earlier part of the century, you'd realize that there's a sense of there's a sense of revolutionary kind of a way of looking at it, and even the way he draws up landscape drawings. I mean, you never see working drawings which are drawn like this, right? Like how Swati had shown up. So he wanted to kind of experiment, kind of do something which has never been done before. So yeah, this one, so that's and it's kind of started off its own kind of geometry to the way that landscape can then be perceived, because what he used to spend a lot of time in the Brazilian jungles, Okay, so in the Amazonian rainforest, and he would learn about the plants. He would get them out. So he would kind of club these lines are not just lines for making a beautiful drawing, but these lines actually depict a way of moving through the landscape, the way that different plants are grouped together, like large leafed plants which grow taller, as opposed to the small, finer leafed plants which have a lot of color, things like that. Yeah, okay. Yes, Swati. If you're really interested, students, you should actually read more about Roberto Burle Marx. There are books available online as well, and a lot of data. Even that movie Rio, if you have seen, the animated movie Rio, it happens in the Copacabana beach, right? Most of the scenes are like, if you think of Rio de Janeiro, that's the most imageable image that comes to your mind, other than, of course, Christ the Redeemer, the statue of Christ on top of those rainforested mountains. But the whole Copacabana beach was Burle Marx, design. So he kind of looked at landscapes as tapestries because he knew that there would be tall buildings which would come there, and so landscape for him was not just meant to be experienced but also to be looked at like a tapestry, like a painting. Yeah, so from there is this other very influential landscape architect whose work you should really understand is Garrett Egbo. So if you can see this image on the screen is actually Garrett Egbo, who kind of believed in modernism. So Egbo kind of joined Harvard GSD, I think in 1936. And at that time, Harvard Graduate School of Design, the landscape architecture department, was still, kind of drawing up plans which were very imperial, very Beaux-Arts. Next slide, Swati. And Egbo wasn't very happy with what was happening because all around the world, people were moving into this idea of modernism. We were breaking away from the symmetry and the ways in which the imperial landscapes were being visualized. World wars were happening. Like the new world was getting independent. Democracy was being established in different areas around the world. So he, along with Walter Gropius, kind of started exploring this idea of taking landscape architecture to a different level. Like, so basically they looked at how can landscape architecture be a driver for social change. And he was also very, very influential in terms of his writing. So, what you see here, Landscape for Living, is one of the books that Garrett Egbo has written. And also, if you look at the drawings, like you would see that they're very architectural. Right. I mean, the landscape drawings, the trees, kind of form a rhythm. They also kind of do what columns do in a drawing. His drawings are no more flat. His drawings are no more like perspectives, but they are axonometric. They're very, very formal. They're very structured. His walls, his pathways, all of them have a certain characteristic to it. And even if you look at the way that he draws those trees, they kind of defy the conventional ways in which trees were drawn then. Right. Next slide, Swati. Yeah, look at this drawing. This is very, very influential because this drawing is almost like an architectural drawing, Like you'd find the points in space, you'd find those points kind of getting a three-dimensional form to form the trees, you'd find the lines, you'd find the surfaces which are there. It's almost like an axonometric drawing of a building. Like if you imagine a drawing of Acropolis, or drawing of any other building, that you would find that's the same way that he kind of visualized landscapes and then drew them out. So there are two things to learn from Garrett Egbo. One is the way that he used to kind of draw, a very architectural way in which he would depict it, and it's not that architectural that it kind of takes the soul out of the drawing also, right? Like if you look at it, every tree has a different way in which it's been drawn out. So even though that tree is actually a representation of what the tree is, it's not a real drawing of how that tree would look like, right? No mango tree would look like that, no elm tree would look like that, but it is actually a depiction of what it may have looked, an impression of what that tree would have looked like in its real form. So that's one learning from him. The other learning from him is the fact that, his push that landscape architecture does not necessarily have to be for the rich, and, it does not have to be garden designs, but it could actually be pushed for social change. Yeah. Next slide, Swati. Yeah, this is a very, very, very effective and a technique which we in KRVI are so used to seeing, right? You would have seen your seniors' drawings, like all synthesis drawings are basically, these exploded axonometrics. Now, as much as we may like to think that it's a KRVI thing, The reality is in 1930s and 40s, there were architects and landscape architects who would actually draw up their drawings like this. So this was a very, very favored way in which Garrett Egbo actually, kind of drew up. And what's interesting is that Garrett Egbo has also done a very, very influential project in India. Can anybody tell me which one is it? Have you ever heard of Garrett Egbo? Or if you haven't, I'll give you a hint. Have you ever heard of Joseph Allen Stein or any of his buildings? Okay. Joseph Hillenstein is an American architect who basically made India his home. And he's designed quite a lot of buildings in Delhi, especially in the Lodhi Estate area. Lodhi Estate was like this institutional area that was carved out of the southern fringes of the Lutyens' Delhi, where the British Delhi ended. That's where the Lodhi Gardens were. So Lodhi Gardens was one of the first parks in India, like one of the first imperial parks in India because Lady Wellington, kind of saw those old monuments, lying around in the fields, and she said, "Let's make a beautiful garden." And so there was this British idea of creating follies. Okay, Follie or Follly. Follies are basically these ruins that the English garden designers would create and then place it in a garden. So the idea was you walk through a garden and suddenly you take a turn and then you see this old ruin of a building on top of a mountain, and it's framed by the plants. So those those artistic or architectural entities which were placed in a garden were called follies, and follies actually have a French meaning which basically means a madhouse. So you can read about all of this, but we're just kind of touching these points so that it kind of helps you develop not just an understanding with respect to drawings but also an understanding with respect to why are things the way they are. So, and the reason why I'm actually emphasizing on follies is also because later on in the slides we'll be talking about them, a modern version of them. The British kind of looked at the Lodhi Garden tomes as follies, So they designed a garden around it, but that garden was not really democratic. It was only meant for the rich, the British, the officers who were living in India at that time to kind of take a stroll and have picnics on Sunday afternoons. When India got independent, there was a lot of changes that had happened, right? Chandigarh was commissioned, the New Delhi master plan was basically made, and things like that. So that is when Joseph Ellenstein actually came in and he proposed this whole um, institutional area just outside Lodi Garden. And he also got in his friend Garrett Egbo to come into India and redesign Lodi Gardens as a park. So if you look at Lodi Gardens, it's the design of it as it stands today. It's very similar to Central Park, New York, like in many ways. But what Garrett Egbo also did was, he kind of looked at those tombs as objects in space, and he would plant palm trees around them and lay the pathways, and he would make drawings exactly like these. Unfortunately, those drawings have never been documented and they're kind of lost. Yeah, so let's go further, Swati. Over to you, Swati. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Sandeep. So this is some of Aldo van Eyck's work. Now, Aldo van Eyck is from the Netherlands, and his work was essentially influenced by this idea of structuralism. So you kind of also see that his work is, very robust, and it kind of, even when it's talking about a landscape, it still has a very structural and sculptural quality. It's very hard edged in that sense, but it's a division of multiple objects. So some of these the drawing that you see, essentially this is what will get built, and it kind of gets extruded from the plan itself. But it is a play of kind of walls and all these hard edged elements that come together. It also has a series of these processes that the drawings go through, and then you eventually have a collection of objects that come through in his work. But I think largely he also spent time developing playscapes, and that was one of the larger interventions that most of his kind of work had. So this, if you see this is a very interesting kind of a playscape where you just see that a series of objects have come together. They've kind of been extruded from the plan itself, and it creates a very interesting kind of space. And it's basically this kind of a rectangular plot is just divided within some of these objects sprinkled over. and it kind of has this balance of very, solid elements versus some of these lightweight kind of work. So it also has a very sculptural quality. There is a certain proportion to how these play out, and how one can place themselves within this kind of space that he has created. Again, a very interesting kind of intervention where, that it's almost like a sand pit in the middle of a large conversion of streets, and it's that so these are some of these are this is the same no, yeah, this is the same intervention, but these are some of the interesting kind of um, um, a way that ways that his drawings got manifested into actual working. This is one of the pavilions that he had designed, which again, you see that there is a very there are very pure forms which have come together, and they actually act as, objects, and they're kind of creating this kind of space that you're going to be within. So it is essentially landscaped space, but it's not necessarily talking about the softer elements, but it's going with all the kind of solid and hard edged elements which kind of create a sculptural space for one to be within. Um, and taking that idea forward, I think we have also been speaking to you all from the beginning about what an object is in a landscape, and whether you have certain associations with certain objects and things like that. And I think this the works of Isamu Noguchi, who's also one of one of the pioneers of changing how one looked at landscape or an external environment. Although most of the work didn't get built, but there is a sense of how one approaches or thinks of, the outside when you see Noguchi's work. Um, uh, there's a Noguchi museum in the US, and he's actually an American landscape artist, eventually called as a landscape artist. This is some of the drawings of, the objects that he created as part of his visualizations of an outdoor kind of space. So this is, we're going to see in the next few slides how some of these have actually been built, and they have been included in either a biennale, or some of them he's kind of also built as part of playscapes. And today, when it's also part of the Noguchi Museum, it's kind of being celebrated, and they're trying to see how some of these objects can be kind of used and placed elsewhere to create interesting moments in an outdoor space. Um, yeah, so I thought it was interesting to put in this image because this is Noguchi at work, and and this kind of a landscape with just impressions in the ground, or impressions in the earth, is what Noguchi kind of eventually stood for. Um, these are some interesting objects which eventually did get built. This one you saw also in the sketch. I think this was at the Venice Biennale, and yeah, this is one of the museums. Um, so I mean, the whole idea of how this kind of sits within a large kind of scape, and it stands out as a sculpture within a very large landscape is what is interesting to see. Some of his drawings, again, how they speak about each object as elements that are defining the space. There is an idea of axis, there is an idea of connectivity, but it's not restricted to any orthogonal kind of planning, so to say. It has its own way of kind of flowing and connecting with each other. I think, and each object has its own place and personality. I think that is what is interesting to take.
Yeah,
It has a very visual and graphic kind of quality, and it kind of brings all these elements together.
yeah, yeah,
Sandeep, if
and
you'd like to.
yeah, and also if you look at this plan, you'd realize that even though it's a 2D drawing, a flat drawing,
Hmm.
if you actually look at the shadows, the way the shadows have been drawn upon those architectural entities, you can see the entire three-dimensional thing happening in the drawing, right? So those lines, those contour lines don't mean much to us right now. But the moment when we see that slant wall, or that square building that sits on the south of the drawing, the shadow kind of falling on it, you'll realize that, oh, this is, like, then we can actually read the drawing in three dimension just by virtue of a two-dimensional plan by the use of psyrography. I think that's also very, very pertinent in this drawing. And what is also very interesting is that in this modern era of landscape architecture, a lot of experiments, a lot of newer projects, and in terms of drawings, in terms of spatial, experiments, were all done in urban playgrounds. Okay, so Naguchi is one great example that Swati is showing us. Then there is Paul Friedberg, who's also a very, very influential landscape architect, whose works also started off with playgrounds. So one of the most accessible playgrounds that Paul Friedberg has created is in the Central Park, New York. And, so that's where they start experimenting with form and, and different types of materials, etc. Yeah. Go ahead, Swati. Thanks.
Yes, these are some just some more images to show the kind of um, uh, work that may not have necessarily been built, but has been visualized, and just through models and impressions of sculpting this kind of space, how you could, one could make a difference. So I think it's interesting for you all to also kind of look at it further. There's many more such examples, and if you all can also pick something from it, if there is some kind of connection to how one represents these kind of spaces that you all can establish with um, um, some of the images that you see. I think it would be interesting for you all to include in the work that you are currently doing in this project. Um, Again, this is the one that you saw with Noguchi himself. Yeah, essentially just the sculptural quality and the materiality, how tactile the entire kind of scape that he is trying to visualize is. I think that itself is a narrative, and it allows you to kind of sense the space through this photograph. If I were to say, I mean, that's what I feel when I look at his work. Um, yeah, this is one of the few projects that actually did get um,
Yeah.
built. Uh, yeah, these are some of the objects that you saw in the drawing initially, and it's a playscape that has kind of been put together with a lot of the objects that Noguchi has visualized. Um, Similarly, another one. So all these objects you kind of saw in the drawing initially, and that's what it came to be
Yeah,
eventually.
yeah, and what is phenomenal about these projects is that they do not imagine a playscape as a cluster of swings and slides and a
Mm.
seesaw and a merry-go-round, which is our imagination of how a playscape is, right? This one is cultural. It's beautiful. It kind of creates a place, but at the same time, it allows the children to personalize these play equipments, or rather these sculptures, and create what they want to do. So a child can imagine it as a castle. Another group of children can actually imagine it as a forest. They could do so many things. They could have multiple play, and child psychologists actually speak about this imaginative play, or the ability of a playscape to allow a child to personalize it, or a group of children to kind of look at it the way they want to look at it, is actually the best design of a playscape, rather than our imagination of a chota beam sitting on top of a seesaw, and like that ugly imaginations that we adults kind of impose on children. Yeah. Over to you, Swati. We can go faster. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, just another project by Noguchi. So I think you'll have got a sense of what his works have been about. So I think we move to the next project, which is the Metro Forest project. Over to you, Sandeep.
Okay, so very quickly, this project was basically included because we wanted to tell you that drawings can actually make a big difference in the way a space is actually designed. Okay, so this is a small project in Bangkok, in the outskirts of Bangkok, actually very close to the Suvarnabhumi airport, wherein the Petroleum Corporation of Thailand decided to create a urban public park, which with all noble intentions of corporate social responsibility and things like that. So in this forest, unlike a public park, what they did was they kind of created a Miyawaki forest. Now, if for those of you who don't know what is a Miyawaki, yeah, I'm just typing these things in Miyawaki forest. Yeah. You can check it later. So essentially, there's a building inside this drawing. Like if anyone can spot the building, it's great. It's actually where 10 and 9 is. If Swati, if you could just run the mouse around. So the way that the building is, so the idea is that, drawings are very powerful. Okay, so in this particular case, the building is designed to be hidden, both physically as well as in the drawing. So there is a roof garden on top of the building, which is basically the one that kind of that you see as number 10, and number 9 is this gash through which you kind of enter, and like from a forest you enter these two parallel walls, and then you kind of move into the building. It's like an exhibition center, an art gallery kind of a thing. So it's actually a public project which is designed to be like a park. Yeah, next slide, Swati. But what's interesting is that the drawings are not static. Okay, so this is how the project kind of came about. Maybe we'll not talk about it now, but you can see it, like how from a garbage dump that it was, like in the first month to where it became in like 36 or 38 months, 38 on like 3 years, so how do you sculpt the land, and, and you can then start seeing, the drawing or actual site ka, relationships. How do they kind of manifest as the land is sculpted? Then the trees are kind of laid. So, like heights vary, the spatial enclosures vary over time. Yeah, next, Swati. Yeah, so this is a very, very, very intelligently drawn drawing, because what it does is instead of a plan, it uses an oblique, to kind of explain everything that is there in the project very quickly, and the different zones of vegetation. So they are basically trying to recreate different types of communities of plants in there, in the hope that those communities will then of plants, like those cluster of plants, will attract a certain kind of birds and animals. So one could have a very diverse ecosystem within a small plot. It's almost like a microcosm of a larger Thailandian landscape, like an untouched Thailandian landscape. Yeah. Next slide, Swati. So if you look at the sections, you would find that, there is a way in which, the sections are designed to kind of show not just what is on top of the soil, but also below it. In the earlier slide, but in this particular slide, it's about phasing. So projects like these are never static. Unlike a building, like कि हाँ मैंने 2001 में काम शुरू किया, 2003 में project खत्म. That's not how landscape projects work, and especially these regeneration sort of projects. So those projects actually are phased. So first, after planting, what happens? After 3 years, what will happen? After the 10th year, what may happen? So what may happen is actually, the trees which are fast growing, which are actually behave like nurse trees to the other plants, will take over, and they'll eventually die. And the ones which are the trees which would probably stay for like 100 years or something, but they're slow growing trees, they would kind of take over. So there is this understanding, and this is how they kind of depict it through the eras. So there is an oblique which gives even a layman, you don't have to be a landscape architect or an architect to understand what's happening there, and a section, and that section is very, very clear in terms of the species, the heights, the way the enclosures kind of happen. So and if you kind of closely look at it, there is also a boardwalk in this project. So the ground is left free for the forest to take over. The humans actually walk on a elevated walkway. Like in the first few years, the elevated walkway is completely visible, and you're like on top of the landscape looking down on it. But eventually, by the 30th year, you would find that the elevated walkway is nowhere to be seen, because it's kind of hidden in between the canopy of trees. Yeah, Swati is actually pointing it out to us. Yeah, thanks, Swati. Next slide. So in the next slide, you'll see the actual manifestation of this. So this is probably in the fifth or sixth year of this project kind of coming up. I think this was done in 2014, 15, and this photograph was taken somewhere in the 19s, if I'm right. And so like the elevated walkway is still there. You can actually look down on the forest now, but eventually it'll get covered. Next slide, Swati. Yeah, that's the building. So the building is kind of a non-building per se. The image on the right kind of shows you the entrance of it. You almost feel like it's just a boundary wall, right? It doesn't look like a building at all, peeping through the vegetation. While on the slide on the left actually shows you that central walkway, that gash in the landscape that allows you to kind of enter the courtyard from which you enter into the building. And the roof of it is also planted so intelligently that it almost feels like it's a wild landscape, and it almost feels like a mountain. It doesn't, or a hillock. It doesn't really feel like a building. Next slide, Swati. So this project was important because like the way of drawing, or the way of actually making drawings which will help in understanding or depicting a landscape, that was a very, very important aspect in it. Yeah, Swati.
Yeah, so this project was eventually, I mean, it's also been built, but what's interesting to see is that, how it has been depicted, and you kind of sense the space very well through the image. So it's very, it's all candy floss and pop and things like that. But I think that is what the idea of kind of explaining the intent of the project is. Um, it's a very interesting kind of space. Again, this is a elevated walkway which was kind of taken over and has been revitalized. So you see that this is the initial plan, and you kind of see yeah, it's the large kind of expanse it has in terms of the connection. And then you also see very interestingly how the entire walkway has been designed with the proportion of these planters which have been included. These are some of the detailed drawings just thrown in to kind of give you a sense of what the proportion of the two are. But essentially what we want to look at is this kind of a visualization of the entire scape, and how you're kind of bringing the various points or aspects that you want to connect with. So this is essentially your project, but how are you actually connecting with the existing forms of landscape which are related to what you are doing? I think this was very well depicted in this entire view that MBRDV has created, and it kind of identifies all the other patches of land which exist, and how visually also you're making a connection through the entire drawing in a sense. So eventually you
Okay.
would see. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just again a little bit of tidbit. So basically, this is in Korea, and Korea has some interesting projects. So this is actually it was a flyover. It was a vehicular flyover, and then it was abandoned. And then they thought, what do we do with it? And then they said, let us make it pedestrian. There was a design competition, and MBRDV won it. And now it's a wonderful kind of public space for the city. There are other examples in Korea as well as so MBRDB has also done in Taiwan. I think there's an abandoned mall. So instead of kind of tearing these things down, because I mean there's this idea of build something. There's a lot of energy which goes into it in terms of not just human energy, but a lot of material resource goes into it. So instead of breaking down, hello, can you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Instead of tearing things down, the idea is that how do you adapt these things? So you adapt a flyover, you adapt an abandoned mall, and turn them into public spaces. So it's a very interesting and a different way of kind of approaching uh, infrastructure, which is actually either defunct or from another era. I mean, you don't kind of focus on cars so much anymore. You focus on public transport, and therefore, what do you do with all of these flyovers that were built keeping the car at the center? Yeah, so that's just a bit on this project. Yeah, Swati, go ahead.
Thanks, Jude.
Thanks,
Um,
Jude. Yes, Swati, go ahead, please.
yes, yes. So these are some of the, you know, the objects that come into the entire flyover to kind of make it habitable and an interesting walkway. So, you know, you have cafes, you have decks, you have a greenhouse. So they come, you know, they show up at multiple points, and that's how it becomes a very engaging kind of public space. And and what's interesting is that it's happening at an elevated kind of level. Um, so that's what you get in terms of a visualization. You know, so this is kind of running through um, an entire large expanse of the city, and from somewhere at the bottom, this is what you're going to see. That's what it looks like in the evening. Yeah, this is the images of when it was once built and kind of done. Um, so yeah, I think that largely the idea of kind of including this project was, one was how it was depicted in the drawing, but also about how an elevated kind of existing space was rejuvenated and recreated. And most times we speak about the High Line, but some of these other projects are also very interesting and have added life uh, to the setting that they are in. Over to you, Sandeep.
Yeah, okay. So from that very interesting urban insert, like we come to another such brownfield project. So if you know what is a greenfield versus a brownfield project, a greenfield project is one wherein there was pristine nature before, and then we humans start moving in and we clear it up and make a building there. Like most of our, let's say our Panvel Airport is a classic example of a greenfield airport. Okay, well, a brownfield project is one wherein there is an existing development and then we built over it or we kind of readapt it or whichever. So like for example, all the mill land projects in Mumbai would be brownfield. Even this MBRDV flyover project would also be kind of considered as a brownfield project. Now this is a very, very important project in terms of both architectural landscape and even urbanistic history, like the way that the urban theories were kind of formulated in terms of psychospatial movement and things like that, also in terms of programs. We won't go into the details of it right now. Maybe we can revisit it a later lecture, but today's intent is to kind of get you introduced to it. Have you guys seen or heard about this project, or have any of your theory of design classes kind of spoken about Parc de la Ville, students? Students, are you there, or am I speaking to a blank screen?
No, they haven't.
Okay, okay, sure. So this was basically a design competition in the city of Paris, somewhere in around 1982, 83. And this area was actually a slaughterhouse in the past. Okay, so it was an abattoir. So there was an international competition that was floated for designing a park for the city and also a series of architectural programs and spaces. Okay, so and imagine 82, 83 around the world there was no internet, there was nothing, but still they received almost around 500 entries. Like 470 entries to be precise. And there were two entries that were kind of shortlisted and then kind of selected. One was by OMA, Remkulas, and the other was by Bernard Schumi. Now, in the landscape architectural world, this kind of created a big ruffle because both Remkulas and Bernard Schumi are not landscape architects, right? But then how would their designs be selected over a landscape architectural design was a big this thing. Okay. So Ambika says we saw it yesterday in the Tectonic studio. Awesome. Thanks, Ambika, for saying that. Yeah. So the diagrams that you see on the screen are basically the diagrams of OMA, which is Rem Koolhaas's project, wherein The main idea was not to show anything that's kind of very definitive, but something that is very programmatic, so the diagram on the left basically shows that's a site, and if one were to kind of put in all the programs, like the areas and other things as a chunk, that's what it kind of comes to. The second drawing, the second drawing or the stripes is actually where Remkulas kind of gets his genius in place. Okay, it's like what you see are those programmatic bands, which are laid from the east to the west. It's almost stacked like floors of a building, right? So in the next slide you'll see what it means, but we'll go to the third drawing, which basically are the points or the grids, which it's almost like a confetti. Remkulas kind of goes about putting in the smaller facilities, like let's say a kiosk or a playground or a barbecue pit, and things like that, which are basically on a grid that is not necessarily a planned, regular grid, but that kind of spots on. So these are different layers, right? You have the strips, which are the programmatic layers, almost like a section of a building, like different programs in different layers, and then you have the points or the confetti, like wherein you're kind of like throwing around different spots, but on a regimental kind of a grid. And then you have the third layer which kind of comes on it, which is the axis of the circulation. So this dark north south line that you see is basically a promenade, like the Parisian promenades that you have. And then there are other secondary pathways that kind of link up the various spaces to it. And then you have the final layer of the larger functions and the programs that kind of are overlaid onto it. So Aswati, if you go to the next slide. So this is the power of drawing, so this is exactly what is it? These are transects. Okay, now these are different programs. Like we spoke about the programmatic bands, right? The different programs which are kind of laid out as different bands. Now, if that instead of a plan, if a plan were to look like a section, or a plan were to look like a series of slices, like like imagine I have a cake in front of me. I'm going to slice it at every inch, chuck, 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 and then I'm going to kind of lay them out, almost like elevation, so that even though I'm looking at a plan, I can get a sectional understanding. I can understand what is the elevation and all of it. So this was one very powerful technique of kind of doing that. Next slide, Swati. And this is almost reminiscent of how a building section would work, right? I mean, on the right hand side, what you have is actually a building section of a skyscraper. On the left is the OMA scheme of the programmatic bands, but what it does is when you split different programs onto different floors, there the connection gets broken, right? Unless you have an atrium or something that kind of allows for a physical connection, the connection gets broken. But when it's on a plan, you can actually seamlessly move from one program to the other. Even though you are experiencing one programmatic band, you could still possibly see the other, so it kind of allows for those connections. But that is for another day. Let's move on, Swati. Yeah, so on the right is one very, very effective hero shot of the project proposal, which OMA's office had kind of done for it. Now, if you look at it, it's very, very different from the landscape drawings which were basically made during those days. Like imagine this is the 1980s. And look at the plan. It's highly architectural. That was also the time when the world was moving away from analog drawings, like hand drawn drawings to the digital drawings. So and obviously, like, so these drawings were kind of hybrid. They were not really hand drawn, but at the same time, they were not really generated by a computer. So it was a very different technique. And one could see that transition even in the way that these drawings were kind of drawn up. Next slide, Swati. Yes, and here comes the winner of this park proposal. So even though OMA's
Sandeep, we're losing you.
Let's just wait for him to come back, or we can proceed.
Swati, do you have some other project that you can run, and let Sandeep come back to this when he's back?
Yeah, I mean we're almost towards the end of it. We can.
Yeah, should do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I'm just going to the slide at a little towards the end. I think so. Some of these are drawings by architects Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakuna. Anuradha is essentially a landscape architect, and similar to what Sandeep was talking about, and when you kind of make drawings more sectionally. Actually, this is some of the drawings that are put together for when they wrote the book on Mumbai being an estuary. Most of their work revolves around water and understanding the equation of water with a larger landscape within a larger landscape. So it's essentially revolving around wetness and what wetness is versus a patch of dry land, and the concepts of that have been researched and worked on much in detail by the two of them. Um, but this is
Yeah, I'm
essentially
back.
part.
I'm back. Thanks.
Yeah, Sandeep, I'm just running through some parts and we can go back to
Sure, sure, sure. No, no worries,
those.
no worries. Yeah. So this is
Uh,
very similar
yeah,
to the OMA's technique of slicing and then seeing a
yeah,
plan through sections. Yeah. Go ahead, Swati.
yeah. So based on what Anuradha and Dilip's work essentially talks about water. This is essentially coming from the book called Soak, which you would also find in your library, and you would also find snippets of it online. This is essentially splicing the city of Mumbai into various sections and kind of studying its equation with water, and the various water bodies that exist as well. What their understanding or what they say is that essentially we end up studying these aspects more in plan, but what happens if we kind of just spliced it across through various sections and see what the equation of land versus water is. So some of these drawings are experiments in that direction. And then you kind of come to this kind of a complex um, uh, kind of a drawing where you're seeing how they've pulled out various aspects of the intervention itself, or the landscape existing itself, and kind of talking about each aspect a little bit more in detail. So it talks about the various species of planting. It talks about what are the hard edges that you are kind of experiencing. It talks about the various, if there are any agricultural plots. So it's kind of defragmenting the whole existing landscape and kind of bringing out what the sectional qualities of each of them are, and studying that further. So this is a very it's an interesting drawing in terms of a study. And that's what their work has also been involving. It's been involving more kind of trying to understand drawing as a tool to study landscape further, whether it is existing or whether it is kind of coming to developing an intervention. So this is again an experiment in that direction, and it can have more ways than one of looking at it. So that's largely it about uh, Anu and Dilip's work. If Sandeep, if you would like to add to it.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So this, I think I'll switch on my camera because I have started getting a very eerie feeling that the students are snapping out. Please don't. It's like a very, very interesting collection of drawings, okay? And a lot of learning. So we're not going into the depths of things because we want you to kind of just hear us out, maybe take notes, and then later on maybe read about them, because otherwise it becomes impossible to process so much of information in like 1 hour's time. So this is a very, very interesting kind of a proposal, because this drawing is a hybrid. I mean, it's neither a plan, it's neither a perspective, it's not a section, it's not an elevation, but if you look at it, it's actually all of it together. Right. This is for the airport in Juhu, like where the Mithi kind of has been made to move like 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, and then kind of go in. So next drawing, Swati. And
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Swati. You can speak.
yeah, I think we can go back to the Bernard Sumi project.
Oh, sure, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. So
Anita, go ahead.
yeah, so very quickly, so Shumi was highly influenced by the post modern, like he by the the deconstructivists, like Jacques Derrida. So Shumi's work basically was, kind of very emblematic of this theory of deconstruction. Now we won't go into that in detail in the landscape class, but what's important is, so those red spots that you see, Shumi called them follies again. Okay, so remember the follies that we spoke about in the beginning? So these were also follies, and the way that movement was kind of choreographed within this park was very, very important. So one way of movement was it was a two-dimensional, two coordinate axis of a movement between folly to folly. And each of these follies were left as unprogrammed blocks. Okay, like there were 3 floors high, and they were each of them were different. Each of them were like a sculpture of their own, and if I'm right, they are placed at a grid of 120 meters, between each other. And these are unprogrammed 3-storied spaces that can be altered or, kind of imagined as any programs that you want to. So during the summers, some of them could double up as a ice cream kiosk or a quick restaurant where people could sit up and, the ground floor people could vend it. In some other times, it could become a library. There could be different multiple uses for it. That was one way of movement. The second movement was a sequential promenade that kind of helped people move around, through the multiple programs, so which kind of extended the city grid. So even in the Remkula's thing, you would see the same lines, right? The north-south and the east-west, but at an angle, that kind of a thing. The third movement was basically a very experiential pathway. Okay, so it was basically called the Promenade Cinematique. Now, what is it? We'll come in the next slide. Swati, if you could move to the next slide. Um, yeah, that red squiggly line that you see on the right side image, so it's called the cinematic pathway, or it was meant to be like vignettes. So you kind of move through that experiential pathway and you see the different programs from different perspectives, right? You don't in a straight line, you'll have a focus and you'll always be walking in the same direction. Your vista is always in the same angle. But in a pathway that squiggles and moves around, what happens is you get to see multiple dimensions or multiple versions of it. So what Banachumi had in his mind was it was almost like a trailer of a movie, and the metaphor he kind of used it like that. So a trailer in those days used to be movies were what they were in celluloid strips, right? They were basically these celluloid strips. So imagine you had a celluloid strip roll and you just throw it out. Like what will happen? It will kind of fall down like a whole thing. So that was exactly how it was kind of visualized. So it's metaphor. It's like there's a lot of philosophical underpinnings to the way that this park has been designed. So on the left side, you have the lines and the
Sorry.
ridges and all of it. Yeah, no problem. And the grid and the surfaces, right? And in the next slide, you will see the actual manifestation of it, the photograph, of how the park is designed to be. So um, yeah, you can see that large circular opening out here, and the circular clearing, and there's a spherical orb. Oh no, what is it called? The geodesic, the geode. Yeah, it's called the yeah, the circular geode, which and each of and the older buildings which were there, they were repurposed, and there were more buildings that were created, and the follies, they kind of dot the landscape. They kind of form these markers in the landscape. So this is how the park is now. What is very very pertinent to note is that even though this park and the design contributed so much to architectural theory, and the way that one would look at programming spaces, and like how can the program be devoid of the site, or the site be devoid of the program, and all of it as a public space. There was the public voting that was done in the recent past, and Parc de la Ville was voted as one of the worst designed landscape parks by the people who were using it. So the truth is, like either people hate it or people love it, but then it's very difficult to kind of ignore it, so the reactions have been very very strong for this project. Yeah, next slide, Swati, we can move on. Okay, now very quickly, now it's very very important, okay, for you to kind of pay attention and kind of just hear us out. Because from now on we move to an era. So this is the 1960s now. We again go back in time to 1960s. We move to an era wherein landscape architecture as a profession was then seen as one wherein one wherein we were not looking at landscapes as just beautiful tapestries for a building or a foreground or a background, but that was a time when there was a visionary landscape architect by the name of Ian McHarg. You'll read about him and know about him much more in the coming semester. But in this semester, it's important to kind of understand what was he and what was his philosophy towards landscape. So Ian McHarg basically looked at landscapes as living systems. Okay, so for the first time, we had a landscape architect who kind of actually spoke about, looking at drawings not as mediums of conveying ideas, but looking at drawings as reading the landscape, as the way landscape is. So the image that you have on the screen is actually a cross section or a transect through the sand dunes of a beach. Now many of you may ask me, do beaches have sand dunes? Yes, beaches do have sand dunes. Sand dunes are not just a desert phenomenon, but most of us don't see it because most of the urban beaches that we are used to going in, the sand dunes have either been flattened because of movement of people, or sand dunes have been used for creation of those kolivadas or those villages. So that's why we don't see the sand dunes in many cases. But these sand dunes are extremely important for uh, the for the for different communities of plants to kind of live in. And also if there is a flood event, or if there is a sea rise or an urge like of the sea to kind of come onto the land, the sand dunes actually protect the hinterlands. And this in this drawing, if you see the bands that you see below are the different transects where a certain species of plant kind of grows. So this is like for the first time, a section is being used, an architectural section is being used to depict the different communities. Yeah, let's go ahead, Swati. Mechag was famous for his studies on landscape, and also for kind of putting in a scientific lens of how do you really study a landscape. Like, we all say in architectural studios, right? Site dekho, site study karo, and site ke hisab se, a design should be there and all of it. But here is for the first time, like a landscape architect who proposed a scientific method in which a landscape, especially for larger projects, landscape could be studied and documented, and a build suitability could be made. So his idea was that like you don't look at a landscape as okay, like a plot as, let's say, it's 100 acres, and as per the FAR we can build up to 60 acres, so let's put a building anywhere and everywhere. So it was not a very technocratic kind of a thing for him. But what he said was, if it is a 100-acre campus, let's start looking at the site. Next slide, Swati. Wherein he said, let's study all the abiotic or the non-living or the biotic or the living, and the anthropogenic, like the human centered things, and then kind of delayer the site, in a way. So what you see here is actually called a layer cake model. It's almost like a rainbow cake. Like if you ever had a rainbow cake, it's almost like a rainbow cake model, right? Wherein you study the landscape and you read the landscape in, like, topography is one layer, hydrology or the way water moves through is another layer. The plants, the low lying plants are one layer. The trees are another layer, and you kind of separate them and you draw them out in different layers. At that time in the 1960s, imagine they were basically drawn on glass sheets with acetate markers. And then just like how you have a GT table, right, or a topo table, right, wherein you used to kind of trace drawings. So in that time they would use a topo table like that, like a table, a glass table with light from below, like a translate table. And these acetate marker boards would be layered one on top of the other, and another layer would be placed on it, and they would start hatching those areas which are important to be preserved, or areas which are okay to be built over, like where there are no things. So based on the suitability that you would want to create, like based on the different, like let's say I put topography and I put water, and then I would hatch certain areas. What, you can go to the next slide, maybe more clear to them from there. So this is Narendra Juneja, who worked with Ian McHugh at that time, and this is the Indo-Gangetic Plains in north of India, right? So this was like different things. You don't have to go into the details, but I just want you guys to know what it is. And so there were different suitabilities that were given to them. Like some areas are okay to build, some areas are not to be built, etc. So the areas which were okay to be built were the lightest, and the areas which were not okay to be built were the darkest. So when you overlay one on top of the other on top of the other, next slide, Swati. And through the light you would find that there are some areas which are extremely dark. So those areas were then kind of marked as areas for preservation or areas left for landscape. And the lighter ones were then marked as areas which could then be built. McHugh wrote a very, very important book called Design with Nature in the 1969, which and this technique of overlaying also became a forerunner of what we know today as the GIS, right? The Geographic Information System software, wherein it's the same. You're kind of learning or reading a city and kind of documenting it in different layers and then using those different layers, using the software to kind of get the answers. Next slide, Swati. Yeah, so these are his acetate, original acetate, drawings where the slope, surface drainage, soil drainage, etc. kind of marked, overlaid, and on the right, if you look at it, like there is a legend down, which kind of tells us about different gradations of color. So the gradation kind of decides whether that area could be built or that area should be preserved. Like a very scientific lens of using drawings to kind of study or read a landscape. Next slide, Swati. So that was Mecca. Now, these are different drawings of us. We don't have to go into the details. I just wanted you guys to see it once, so to understand that there are different modes of drawing. And drawings are not just whimsical, impressions of an architect's, mind, but they could also be a depiction of what is there, the ground reality at site. Next slide, Swati. Next slide. Yeah, so this is by one of Ian McHugh's contemporary, whose name is Lawrence Halprin, another very, very important figure in the landscape architectural history. So Halprin was a modernist, okay, and his wife, Anne Halprin, was a dancer. And she also kind of contributed to modern theater in many ways. So, I mean, I'll give you a little bit of a trivia. Like, if you've seen Dil Se, the movie, and if you've seen that song Satrangi Re, wherein which was like the seven shades of love, and like you would find one frame wherein you'd find Shahrukh and Manisha in a red kind of a wrap around them. It's like two bodies in one wrap, like a cocoon, and they're just moving around, with their bodies kind of bulging out in different places, their movements, and there is this pristine Ladakian landscape behind it. That was basically copied right from Lawrence Halprin and Anne Halprin's, dance drama, which was basically Lawrence Halprin would design the landscape and Anne Halprin would have these different human bodies moving in space kind of a scenario in that landscape. And people would come and watch it and they would have discussions on it. So it was the 1960s and 70s were a great time for, like for art, history, landscape, architecture, everything in general. But the slide that you're seeing on the screen is basically a timeline. Imagine we've drawn timelines, we've seen timelines which our seniors have drawn out. We've seen how boring they could get, one line with years marked out and all of it. But this is a geological timeline of a site which Lawrence Halprin kind of worked for many, many years, for decades together. It's called the Sea Ranch, which is like a community that he was a part of. And that is like from the origin of the world to now. How has that site kind of moved, from the Precambrian to the Cambrian to the vegetation and all of it? So, drawings have the power to kind of, and it's almost designed like a nautilus, right? A nautilus shell, like if you know what's a nautilus shell, it's also called the curve of life. So there is metaphor, there is depiction. I know there is a lot of scientific information in there, but at the same time, it's a very, very powerful drawing. It's almost like an abstraction of what may have happened in the site through the eras and through the ages. Yeah, next slide. So it's called a Sea Ranch Eco Score, and Halprin also wrote a very important book which is called as RSVP Cycles. Another book that you guys can read if you're interested in, but that's for another day. Now, taking that same philosophy through, this is another very important project. It's called the Renaturation of River Eyre, wherein this is in Geneva. It's by a collective which is called as Super Combine. So Atelier Descombes were the main landscape architects for the project. So what you see in the drawing, now again, the drawing is very important. So what you see is not a terrain map. It's not a 3D map. It's actually a line drawing, but that drawing seems like it's 3D. You can see the mountains and you can see the valleys and the slopes, because like if you zoom into that drawing, you'll know it's just a plain line drawing. It's just by virtue of the thickness of the lines with which you're kind of kind of mimicking that three-dimensional kind of a thing. So here you have a river which was made into a canal, And then in the last 10 years, that canal was being broken up, and it was kind of the river was allowed to kind of flow through the landscape again. Um, so the graphic depiction of it is shown in that black drawing, very clear, right? It's very graphic, but then you kind of understand, okay, there was a straitjacketed river which is now being broken up, and the river is then allowed to reclaim its channel. But we humans are not going to decide its channel. The river is going to take the course. So we don't know what would be the course, which is why those multiple lines. Next slide, Swati. Yeah, and how did they do it? So what they did is, so this line on the straight line, like a road on the top that you see, that these are two photographs, two different timelines. So the straight line that you see there, where Swati's cursor is moving, was the original channel. So what they did is they took up some land to the side of the river, and they just overlaid a honeycomb kind of a structure, actually a lozenge, kind of like a kaju katli, a barfi kind of a structure in there, right? And they just allowed the river to take over. So over time, what you see is what is down there. So we humans are not deciding how the river should flow, but we are basically just creating the basic thancha through which the river would then flow. Now, how did they kind of come about this idea, or how did they kind of do models? Next slide, Swati. Like I mentioned, the barfi. So it's actually a Swiss chocolate, like if you pour hot milk on Swiss chocolate, and then the chocolate would melt in some areas, and it would kind of allow for these patterns to be created, right? So that was one of the inspirations for this project, and that was one of the experiments that was done for this project, and that's how these lozenges were created. And the river kind of took over time. So and what Atelier Descombe also did was using the power of drawings. They documented this process. Next slide, Swati. So if you look at the slide on the screen, you would find the erosion of the lozenges, the path the water has taken, and a figure ground of the same, like the distribution of the lozenges that are still left. So a very powerful drawing if you look at it, like, so when we talk of figure ground or a Norley's diagram, we usually imagine the built versus the open. But here you have the land versus the water, kind of the same technique used for documenting that landscape. So a very interesting way of kind of looking at it. And the beauty of this project is that, yeah, it's like we humans are not kind of pushing forward or kind of drawing how the river should go, but the river is kind of, the nature is allowed to kind of take its course. We are only kind of allowing for the method, or like a way in which that process could just start, and the rest is like it's left for nature to happen. And they also did not reclaim that old channel, but what they did is they created a park, like a parkway in that channel. So you can see small pools in there, there are lawns in there, there are putting greens, there are cycling tracks, there are like small decks, etc., which are there. So the trees were kind of lined that canal, still line it, almost like it is like a memory that is not kind of completely erased, but it's still kind of kept alive. Yeah. Next set, Swati. Yeah, this is something that Swati already spoke about, right? So this is in the last 20 years. Okay, so this project kind of came about. So the reason why we are, kind of talking you and taking you through different timelines and different personalities, different practices, different drawings, is also because, that also reflects the prevalent world views of those times, like the pre-World War, the post-World War, the present, wherein the digital has kind of taken over. Like Ian McHagg's time, like very similar transects. OMA's drawing for Parc de la Ville, very similar transects. But then during those times, it was analog, it was hand-drawn drawings. But now we have digital technology. So the drawings also kind of reflect that technological momentum, or our understandings of the world or the landscape have also changed. So in the past few drawings, like Geoffrey Bawa's times and all of it, drawings were, I mean, landscapes were seen as experiential, they were seen as an extension of architecture. So the way drawings were read and, landscapes were read and drawings were made were different from what is happening in the present in academia as well as in practice. Yeah, so Swati, if we go to the last slide. Yes. So you remember the River Aya project, wherein the different courses of the river were documented. what you see here is not a modern artwork, but what you see on the left is actually a drawing that Anuratha Mathur and Dilip Dakuna, both of them are professors in University of Pennsylvania and Harvard, respectively. This is a drawing, a hybrid drawing of the various channels of Mississippi River that they have kind of drawn up and overlaid. And that's a city of Missouri or Mississippi. Like wherein the city has been affected by floods many a time. So what they've done is they've taken data from the last 200 years and they've kind of overlaid it there. And this vignette on the right that you see is basically the different landscapes. Like it's a transit. Like if you can see, there is a very light line that kind of moves through. It's like a walk, and in that walk, the researcher kind of takes these different photographs, and then those photographs are kind of knitted together, and that forms a very powerful drawing that kind of gives you a lens. It's almost like watching a movie. Like imagine in the earlier times when there was no digital photography, like in your childhood, you may have seen your parents actually having those negatives, right? Those reels. Now imagine, like, so I'm sure Jude would know this. Like when we were doing architecture in our colleges, and when we would go to site, we would only have a Konica or Kodak ka 32 photographs ka ek reel. So one had to be very careful of what one photographs, because everything costs money, right? And so even before printing out all those photographs, we would take a contact print, like a small print of all these small photographs, like a thumbnail kind of a version. So you only had to pay for one print. You would check it, with like, magnifying glass ki ye theek hai, ye theek nahi hai, blurred hai, ye wo, and then we would tell the studio, print me this and this, so that's the way that one would preserve on resources, and so this is almost like these contact prints of a landscape that's kind of put together in one panel. So with that, we come to the end of the presentation. Other faculty members, if you have anything to kind of add, we can, kind of speak about it and have a quick conversation with the students and then move to our individual channels. That probably was a very intense, set of slides, but it was important that you guys see, know, take notes, and then, kind of explore more at this juncture, of this exercise and this journey of starting to understand what landscapes are. Yeah. Over to you, faculty members and students. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep and Swati. Um, I think students should speak because I've not heard of it from anyone. Yeah, so just something from the student.
I hope they're alive.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very exhaustive and very informative. So I think it's better if the students kind of share what
Sure,
they.
sure, sure, sure. Absolutely, yeah. No one? How is it possible? I'm sure you may have seen something through the slides that you would like to know more about, or want to speak something about, or something that you've seen on Instagram or Pinterest, or something that you are attempting to do in your reading, your landscape that you've chosen, or something that intrigued you, something that kind of triggered a response from you. Or was it like so intense that, oh my God, like we can't take this on a Thursday morning? Even if that is your response, that's also fine. But we need to hear from you. And the quicker you open up, the easier it'll be for us to kind of start with our individual discussions.
Hands raised, Ambika.
I think Ambika.
Yeah, Ambika, go
Um,
ahead, please.
I think this lecture specifically was very eye-opening because before this, I used to always hear this quote, which was, "Doctors can bury their mistakes, but architects can only grow vines on it." So I think this was by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I didn't really care much for the landscape. I thought that was always secondary. But just seeing these sort of projects, especially the one by OMA, was quite fun to think that I as an architect can really contribute to the landscape and the urban aspects of my project. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Ambika, for saying that. So it's not just OMA, but also Ian McHugh. Probably we didn't speak too much about the McHughian ways of looking at landscapes or drawing it up, but it may be of interest to you, if you could look at it. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So there is a purpose.
Fleur had also raised the hand.
There was a construction drawing which we saw with like um a not so construction drawing thing in the middle. I mean, can you just
Roberto
add
Burle Marx.
elements?
Yeah,
Can you
Roberto
just
Burle
add
Marx.
it? Add, can you like just add elements in a construction drawing which are artsy? I mean, I don't know, like how would that work? Like would the contractor understand how to plant stuff there? Yeah.
Okay, so this may not be the only plan, Fleur, that Roberto Burle Marx may have created. So the plan that you're seeing here is actually a planting plan. Okay, so if you look carefully, you will see that the trees have, the trees are all numbered and they have a tag to it. And the different colored patches that you see here are actually the ground cover. So what do we mean by ground cover? Ground covers are those short heighted plants that we use as the secondary layer under the tree canopy, right? Like the one that is used to cover, like the lawn and these small shrubby plants that you see, the herbs and the shrubs. That's called the ground cover. So in a traditional planting plan, which you'll see soon, it may either be hatched, like with the advent of AutoCAD, it's all hatched. But in this particular case, Burle Marx chose to kind of color code them. So this is a black and white version of a colored drawing that was basically sent to site. So yeah,
Oh,
it works. Yeah. And,
no,
and
I
there'll be
love
other
that.
drawings which will have yeah. So just don't be disillusioned that this is not the only drawing that was given to site. Probably there may be other drawings which may have each of those points where the curve changes, like the Cartesian coordinates of those may have
Yeah.
been given, like so the setting out plans, etc. may have been given.
No, like I love the idea of like this sort of thing in a construction drawing because like the contrast is pretty cool. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like who tells us that construction drawings have to be boring black and white drawings, which are devoid of life, so completely agree. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Tanay, Neil, Ruhin, anyone?
I'm just calling names. Anushka.
So I mean, not related to this specific the presentation, but I think the one of the projects that I was introduced to was Maya Lin's war memorial. And I think that was a very I mean that was such a simple gesture. The competition, like the entry was very simple, like a just a sketch of an arrow, and the way it developed was very different. And such a simple gesture could win a competition. That was something very different. But yeah.
Ruhi.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
Ruhi.
what I feel is the Seoul Sky Garden is quite superficial in some sense. I mean, when you look at the Highline Park that is in New York, it is embedded within, I mean, even the bridge is sort of used to its most extent, whereas in the Seoul Sky Garden, everything is, I mean, sort of included in within a pot or something similar. So yeah, that was one of the comments.
Okay, that's an interesting observation, but I wouldn't term it superficial because what we don't know is that but what probably there may be constraints, because of which it was done as a kit of parts, like lots of things which are kind of reassembled. Maybe it was a budget, maybe there were structural concerns, or maybe there were guidelines which kind of only allowed the artists to kind of do that. But yeah, what you're saying is right, that that in the Highline everything seems to be embedded, while in the Seoul Sky Garden MVRDV scheme seems to be like an assemblage of things, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was the first thought I had. So,
Okay, yeah, they're two different approaches to like similar cases. Yeah.
Bhushan.
Interesting.
Bhushan.
Bhushan.
I don't know if people are there.
I also don't know now. I think they've slept off or they've probably gone for a stroll in the park. I don't know.
I think if there are no questions, let's. Oh, there is someone.
So,
Sahil. Sahil.
Yes, I.
Yeah, I wanted to I noticed something really exciting about the Seoul Skywalk is that something that was actually take I mean it was a proper build form, as Jude said, that it was a motorable road before, and then when it was abandoned it was converted to this park. So I kind of felt nice when something built in infrastructure was again pulled towards the nature in some sort. So that was really nice to see.
Yeah.
So maybe you should look at another project in Seoul called the Chongyachon stream.
Yeah.
Okay, the Chongyachon stream. I won't be able to spell it, but maybe Sandeep might. Yeah, so it was essentially they ripped open a highway. Hello? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, so
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
there was actually a highway which was built over a river, over a stream, and they ripped the whole highway off, and kind of the stream came alive again. So that's another very interesting. And I mean, in that case, there was no option to keep the highway because it was completely smothering. And another maybe project is also what Frank Gehry is doing right now with the LA River. And I'm sure a lot of other practices together, looking at the LA River. So, looking at what exists within a city and kind of building up on that, rather than, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so, yeah, okay. Anyone else?
So I call it the chunky chunk. That's how I remember it.
Okay, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but yeah.
No. It's just trivia. I mean, like we all have these mnemonics to remember it. Like I used to remember Charles Correa as Maria Goretti because she was a hotshot VJ during the 90s, like when it started architecture. I just couldn't remember Charles Correa for whatever. So I would remember Maria Goretti and then I would link it to Charles Correa.
We
So,
had
yeah.
in JJ, we had a professor who had a massive chip on his shoulder, and he said, "I know North Korea and South Korea, but I don't know Charles Korea." So, anyways, yeah. Okay. So I think we can move to our class. Yeah, our individual batches. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So I'll just